I'd like to welcome James Nicholson presenting Join the Revolution. Please tweet with NLS9 S40. James is the ALIA Estate Manager for Queensland and works at the University of Queensland. Before working at UQ, he worked for Public Library Service and could see firsthand the effect that library fines could have on people, especially children. He also founded and runs a registered charity called the Sleigh Bell Foundation that supports disadvantaged families at Christmas time. Therefore, he is always looking for ways to help disadvantaged break down roadblocks to education, knowledge, support or services. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to speak really slowly because you've got lunch. No, I'm not really. I'll try and get through this so we can all get off to lunch. But basically, I just wanted to begin by acknowledging the Kaurna people as the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So I'm really grateful to be here today to speaking with you, and thank you for the introduction and to where I work currently. But I'm not here in a work capacity. I'm here just as a fellow librarian or a fellow library worker, I guess, just as a fellow human, because this is somewhat of a social justice issue, but I'll get to that in a minute. Before going any further, I've got a hashtag, it's not fine to fine. If you can engage with that, that's great, because the whole thing that I want to get out of this is I want this to begin a conversation. It's already happening, but within this space, and to see what people have around this topic, so that it goes on beyond the end of this talk, I guess. So it's fantastic that in Australia we have such a wide range of libraries and library staff, from libraries that open just 6 hours a week in rural areas right through to our National Library in Canberra. And there's plenty of success stories in those libraries, and plenty that I've witnessed, as well as, never mind all those countless interactions every day that happens across the country that connect, inform, help, support and empower people through their libraries, through libraries in their everyday lives. However, with these many examples of the great work libraries can do, this is not the experience of all of our patrons. And it may be uncomfortable, but we should always be asking difficult questions of our spaces, our practices, our policies, and our attitudes. Are we always inclusive? Are we always compassionate? Are our systems outdated or broken? Can we become better? Can we change? So while you're thinking about those questions, think about this. In 2017, 20% of the 400,000 juvenile and young adult patrons of the New York Public Library had blocked library cards. That's 80,000 kids, teens, and young adults. The problem is that these blocked cards and fine accruals are barriers to information, collections, and services. And one of the problems with fines is that they don't discriminate. So they affect those that can afford them, but they most definitely affect those that can't. Now, that's not to say that most services don't have some discretionary policy where the library workers can waive or reduce fees, remove blockages or resolve the situation in some way. And sure, from working in a big public library service myself in Brisbane, certainly the staff there would do everything they can within the policy and procedures to help the library staff. But not everyone can be reached in this way. This one-on-one discretionary approach is not a long-term solution. It also leaves the library worker as judge and jury, which is uncomfortable for both them and for the patron themselves. So why is the removal of library fines important? Well, it impacts on our patrons and our staff, as I've just said. But in some cases, it can actually cost the library service. And if we think even bigger, I would suggest that it's contrary to the global movements, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So why do we have them? Well, that's a great question, right? I suppose in its simplest form is to ensure the return of items and the continued circulation and accessibility of the collection to all. I mean, after all, why should one patron not bringing back a book on time impact another's right to access that same information? And that's a really great point. Except the problem comes when we realise fines don't work the way that we think that they do, or at least not always. Patrons, for example, can become scared of bringing items back when they've got to deal with that fine accrual. They can also cost the library more than the actual fine in admin and processing costs. And I have a real life example of this that I'm going to discuss in a minute with Casey Cardinia Libraries. Library fines also impact certain groups of people, and even though there may not be the motivation for fines, the income is still counted as a revenue stream. right? So there's something really deeply problematic for me and concerning that a revenue stream on our library budgets is from finding the very patrons that we're trying to empower, right? But above all, I would argue that the crux, finding our patrons goes against our core values as librarians and library workers. Values such as inclusion, diversity, equity, access to information, literacy, lifelong learning. Now, I acknowledge that in many of these areas we have a long way to go as a profession to fully realise them. But I would also argue that these are still values that the majority of us hold dear and we strive for. So I believe that fines are an outdated approach that doesn't align with the message we want to hear from our library services or the practical application of libraries providing access of information to all. But look, this is just one librarian's viewpoint. We need any weight to any argument. And so when you see policy advocating for the removal of library fines, we can use it to strengthen our argument. And we can see some policy reflections through the American Library Association in their manual, and in particular policy B.8.10, relating to library services to the poor and policy objectives, which states that the ALA will implement objectives mentioned in the policy section by, and I quote, promoting the removal of all barriers to library and information services, particularly fees and overdue charges. Now, I understand that cherry-picking policy pieces can be misleading. There's no context or time for you to consider why that was placed in there or the wider context. But I guess with this talk, I just want to get the conversation going at whatever library service you're at. And so by highlighting this, it's just shown that the topic is being brought into policy and can be brought into policy as well. So we can see the importance, and I've touched on policy, but before we get to real-life examples and case studies, I also want to mention a little bit more around theory. So Gregory and Higgins, in their 2018 article, In Resistance to a Capitalist Past, Emerging Practices of Critical Librarianship, they talk about capitalism and its proliferation of libraries and librarianship. The quote explains this. So we find the rise of capitalism and the efficiency movement during the progressive era, and that led to a replicating of libraries in the image of model of corporations. So to me, overdue fines are a classic example of this. We see fines throughout our capitalist society, and look, they can be really effective. They're easy to implement, easy to record, monitor, and they can be scaled or reduced. And look, sometimes they work really well as a cost recuperation, but also as a deterrent, maybe even a punishment. However, in the library setting, I think we need a more human-centered approach, one that takes into consideration those facing the fine, their ability to pay, and the underlying message we're conveying to our communities. As I mentioned before, finding our patrons is an outdated model, and I believe that we can do better. Also, the inherent discrimination towards those of lower income makes this at its core a social justice issue. But you know what, that policy and theory is one thing, but real life is another, and there are plenty of real-life examples and news stories from across the globe of library services putting into practice the cessation of library fines in one form or another. And I've created a website that accompanies this talk, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but links to all of these news articles and resources will be on there. But James, I'm overwhelmed. You can share all of these sources, but can you just give us some examples from around the world with a little bit more context? So, if we look to the United States, first of all, Tana Peckham, so the change is definitely happening. And in the US Cleveland Public Library Service, they'll go for fine-free from this year. And Tana Peckham said the decision to go fine-free starting July 27th is all about access. Cleveland Public Library wants to remove barriers and connect people to knowledge and ideas, not stand in their way. It's worth noting here that they removed overdue fines for seniors in 1977, children's materials in 1978, young adults and homebound patients in 2001. And so that library service saw the value back in the 70s and been pushing that for a long time. So evidently change doesn't happen overnight, but it's something that they've continued to do, and they've seen the value and will move forward with that. And another example comes out of Jackson County. We believe that our libraries have something for everyone, and everyone can benefit from having a library card, said Carrie May, the library director. Removing fees, access to types of cards we offer, and simplifying the application process for a new library card sends a clear message that we want it to be easy and enjoyable to use the library. We put our patrons first. That's an interesting part for me. But it's not just the States, it's the UK too. And if we In early 2018, Trafford Council, with their, and for people unfamiliar with their, Trafford Council covers the Greater Manchester region, basically. Trafford will become the first public library authority in the country to adopt this policy, which sends a welcome message to our residents in Trafford that they will have access to completely free library service. And as well as Trafford, Blackpool Council went fine-free from April this year. Councillor Gillian Campbell, who is the deputy leader of Blackpool Council, said, "The fines were never in place as a money-making scheme. They were designed to encourage people to return books on time. However, we know that this can have the opposite effect. And at a time when every penny counts, even a small fine could be a reason for someone to not return a book." Now, there are plenty more international examples, but let's take a second to look at our own shores here in Australia. And in November 2018, Elizabeth Jack, the Executive Director of Libraries Tasmania, said, "We continue to say libraries should be welcome and accessible to all, but how can we find people and feel that we're accessible and welcoming?" Which sums up my kind of opinion very well. And then when you're thinking about that, the City of Sydney in 2017, Suzanne Bulgen, the manager of libraries and learning at the City of Sydney Library, said, when you charge fines, people feel that they come into the library or get defensive around the fine. So from having a financial implication to not bringing the book back, you can't do anything and owes a fine, we're changing people's behaviour so they're not being punished financially, and it's just about bringing the book back. But you know what? I acknowledge that there's massive breadth and depth to our library services. Public to academic, school or special, it may not work in every case or in one particular form, and it may take a trial to see that, or at least for now that it doesn't work. Interestingly, the Windsor Public Library, which I believe is in the Detroit area of the States, reinstated overdue fines after a 21-month trial period, so nearly a 2-year trial period. The news article actually explains how the library service had issues with items being returned, but it doesn't actually go into detail about what procedures they put in place to try and encourage the returning of items, and I'll discuss that in a minute. And also, it cites a budget black hole, which again brings me back to the kind of the issues I have with that. But certainly, the other deciding factor was that when surveyed, their patrons were saying that they would rather pay a small fine than have their card blocked. But I wonder if that was a majority of patrons, if it was all of the patrons, and whether or not that was a diverse range of people that they'd spoken to. It just doesn't say in the article. But I wanted to bring it up to add a little bit of context. It's not all roses, I guess. But moving on, because I hear you asking the question, well, damn, James, you've just told us why it's important to remove the fines. You've touched on policy. You've shown us what other library services are doing, but I'm about the numbers, and so is my library service. How much is it going to cost us? Wow, great question. Thank you. But I already thought ahead, and I knew that you were going to ask this question. So I spoke to Casey Cardinia Libraries to bring you a real-life case study. And I'd like to say at this point, I'm really grateful to Chris Buckingham, who's the CEO of Casey Cardinia Libraries, for taking the time to talk to me about their approach and their business case, which he shared with me. So to give a little bit of context, the start of the business case was to essentially, or the proposal was to remove overdue fines for a 12-month trial period and to implement a support to comply program that encouraged responsible library use while upholding CCL's core value of fairness. So let's have a look at some of the numbers. While there's a lot to take in here, essentially if we look to the top of the table where I've highlighted, you can see the revenue generated was $110,000. And if we move down the cost of administration, we can see that when you add up all of the different elements, cost of notifications, of salaries and so on, that actually the direct cost for recovery of overdue fines and lost items is just under $15,500. So this leaves the library in a deficit of $5,405.60 just to administer the fines. Now, I'm not suggesting that every library service is going to have this outcome, and I also acknowledge that any business case is going to put your numbers in the very best light that it can. It doesn't cover everything, but what I'm trying to demonstrate is that I guess that when we're considering the cost implications, there may not be let's start again. However, the numbers show in many instances that not only fines extremely low % of revenue overall, but the damage that they do far outweigh the mediocre fiscal gains, if there are any gains at all. So to closing the business case, you can see their conclusion was that there is a direct social and economic benefit from the removal of overdue fines, that they will save time, and that it will redefine its relationship with the broader community and operate in closer alignment. So this is a holistic approach, right? You're considering everything, things that beyond the numbers as well. And the recommendations is that the board support the removal of overdue fines, and that did go from a temporary to a permanent thing, and that they would report back to the board. But one of the most interesting things for me are the kind of unexpected consequences, and two of them are shown here. So while the average length of loan increased slightly, a number of lost items dropped significantly. That's not the case in every scenario, and I'll discuss that in a second, but maybe people were not as afraid to return their items. And this was a really interesting one, that essentially because they didn't have to backdate the shoot, they actually saved time in staff hours and could open the library 30 minutes earlier each day. Again, different libraries operate in different ways, but for this library to get an extra 30 minutes per day is a huge benefit when you consider the broader community and those that have to go to work that maybe could now access some stuff before they do so. But I acknowledge that numbers don't tell a full story, and they might not tell the kind of story you're wanting to hear. And so we have to think carefully about what numbers tell us and make sure we're taking a holistic approach, which looks at qualitative as well as quantitative measures. For example, I have figures here from another library service, real-life library service, which is de-identified, but I wanted to include them because it tells a story of less loans returned after the cessation of overdue fines, and it also shows an increase of borrowers that were blacklisted. Now, in both these cases, it was only a small amount, but the numbers still show that. What's interesting is that the library manager, when he picked up these numbers to pass to me, was very surprised and really frustrated. And actually, I quote him, said, they didn't tell the whole story. That was, they were his words. And so to have a library service that has seen minor increases in lost items and blacklisted borrowers, but continue with a program of no overdue fines, it takes a human-centered approach as the driver. Now, it may come out that the reduction in admin costs will cover the increase, or that next year the trend might go the other way, but we'll have to wait and see. But for me, what's important to take away is that numbers are not everything. And whilst we as library workers can see the benefits of removing library fines, because we're at the coalface, we need to capture this impact. Without it, councils and exec boards will simply turn to the numbers and maybe question the effectiveness of the exercise. So that's a bit of a challenge. But what can we do to encourage items to be returned if not through the threat of fines? Some library services have reduced lending rights until all books are returned and accounts resolved, although this does restrict access. However, access is reinstated when in this scenario, access is returned when the items are returned, okay? As opposed to a library service I used to work for where when the item is returned, the total of the fines is then applied to the card. And if that is over $10, their card would be blocked at that point. So the people have just returned the books, but then we're blocking their access, which seems counter to what we should be doing, which is when they return the books, then you're free to use and take more things, right? There's also other library services that do many of you have seen these, where you can wipe your library fines in exchange for food, but maybe we're asking people to decide between books and food or access and food. Now, that's quite an extreme example. Maybe it's not that case in every scenario, but it's essentially the message, I guess. But it can be effective. And other approaches maybe might take a more human approach, actually summed up quite well by my manager, saying the guilts. So essentially saying this other library person is waiting for the item that you currently have, and maybe some of those it might encourage to bring items back. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's no easy option. Okay, there's no easy answer, and what we're talking about. But this is what we're talking about at the beginning of the talk, which is we have to have these difficult conversations, and there's no easy answer, but they need to be had. So we know that fines don't always work, they go against our core values, and they don't produce the revenue streams they may at first seem to offer. But what should we do about it? Well, it depends on your position. If you work within a library that charges overdue fines, are you a library patron that would like to see fines removed? Are you in a leadership role? And the answer to this question will determine your approach. But here are 4 ways to get you started. Become more informed. So if you want to affect change, you can't do it alone. And you need allies, and becoming informed is the best way to help communicate the message. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to become an expert. I certainly am not. But learning a little bit will go a long way, and driving in your passion will drive you there. And so being able to articulate the kind of the issues will certainly help your case. And talking of case, build a business case. So once people are on your side, you need to present a business case often, and changes of this size don't just happen. Build a business case using the template on my website that approaches, so you can approach council and executives. Cool, thank you. Number 3, write to council for support. Again, I've got a letter on the website. You can write for council for support. That kind of leads into number 4, which is advocate. And essentially, advocate at every chance you get. Make noise, bring it up at meetings, challenge it, bring on board colleagues or friends, and continue to write to council representatives. Speak out on social media and tag appropriate handles. But whatever you do, I think it's important we forget that this isn't an exercise to slam a library service or to slam particular groups of people that are working in these organisations. We want to make noise and bring attention to this important topic, but we need to work with both council and the service to make this change. That means that we are smart in our approach. So speak the council's language of profit and loss, but also speak the librarian's voice of equity and access. But if you want to instigate some change, what resources are available to you? Well, before I knew that this talk was accepted, I began building a website to accompany, and the website address is just there. It's notfinetofind.com. But this is just something that I've created. So I really hope that people will engage, give me information. We can add to those resources and make it the go-to place in Australia. There are other ones around the world, and I link to those as well. But on the website, you can get a number of resources. To give you an idea of what it looks like, this is the website, although it will be changing. I just have not, it's a work in progress. And what with writing this presentation, I've not had the time to make it fully accessible. I need to do a lot of work there, especially with some of the talks I've heard today, so I can work on that. But it's something that's ongoing, so I hope that you'll engage with that. I've also got some references here, so the slides will be passed around, but you can read into those as well. So I hope that you'll start a conversation with whichever library you work for or frequent. Even if you haven't listened to anything I've said, that's okay. It's fine. But I hope you'll hear this. For me, this is a social justice issue. Wherever possible, we need to remove overdue fines to attack the social injustice they represent. If not us, then who? So that's why I hope you'll join me when I say it's not fine to fine. Oh, and I have stickers because I'm a bit cheap and didn't get badges, but I do have stickers, so I hope that you'll...
And I definitely think if there's a question, we'll give you a sticker straight away. Thank you, James, for such a well-researched and thoughtful presentation. And now to the audience for questions. Got one at the back.
Hi, James. Thanks for your presentation. I'm going to ask a bit of a provocative question. How can we get peak bodies such as ALIA or perhaps the Australian Public Library Alliance, for example, to get behind this campaign and really push for it to happen?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And actually, I kind of realised that there may be a question that related a little bit more to Australian context when I kind of quoted the ALA. And so I think in many cases, it's a complex question because certainly ALIA and certainly other organisations are pro-removing barriers. I don't think that these organisations are there trying to find people in some particular way. They want to remove those barriers, right? So, but we need to be more explicit. So this conversation, this advocacy, having these Twitter chats and, I guess kind of having that whole conversation, even at your own library, will really help raise the profile, and it becomes maybe more of a priority, and then it gets more time to be thought about. But it's a difficult question. If anyone has any ideas about those things, then maybe we can get together. That's why I wanted to create a website. That's why I wanted to create a hashtag to continue that conversation, and it only comes with consistent conversation and consistent approach. You saw that with the library services in the States that started back in the 70s, you know what I mean? So that's 50 years of working hard to get to where we are now. So.
Hello, I'm Viv Barton, your Vice President for ALIA, but I'm also on the Australian Public Libraries Alliance. So you'll be pleased to hear that our team is meeting in 2 weeks' time in Sydney, and it is on our agenda. Okay?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, James. Do you know if there's any statistics on how many Australian public libraries still fine?
That's a really good question. I actually tried to find that out. So my original approach was going to be, right, I'm going to go around and find all the public libraries, and then I'm going to write to all of them and see whether or not... And really quickly, I realised that that was not a practical way of doing it, mainly because of the different way library services work at in the different states. So what's difficult is, for example, in Queensland, I listened to Janet's talk from the State Library, and she said that, there's, let's say, 300 independent libraries or, a similar number, but of those, they belong to different library services, you know what I mean? So there might be 30 libraries in Brisbane City Council, and so I couldn't find the amount of library services, and especially in South Australia, there's scenarios as well with one library card as well, and I was just finding it difficult to kind of get that information, but I am going to embark on some research, which what I want to do is approach the library services that have statistics on implementing this, and actually get overall what the return on books were, how many, basically the stats that back up what we've just been talking about.
Can I ask a question? My problem is that library management systems are written with fines as part of the way that we control behaviour, and we as a profession have not advocated to actually go from the stick to the carrot approach. How do we reward customers who do the right thing, and how do we get our software built so that it will actually do that? Do you get a prioritised access to new fiction if you've not had an overdue book for a year, or things like that? I think we need to... If you want to get people to do the right thing, taking a stick approach all the time, I think is wrong. And just to let you know, I think there's one public library in South Australia that still fines out of 69 different library services.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's definitely gained a lot of traction.
You could get that information really quickly by contacting the professional groups in each state. They're on the ground and they'd have a lot more information about that than...
because I contacted state libraries and just found that wasn't getting the information that I needed, albeit a very quick and adequate response, I'd like to say. Look, I think it's a really good point. There's lots of systems that are built for this, and actually that comes back to seeing the model of libraries in a corporate sense, like they're built in a particular way, and that's important for other areas of that library to operate. Obviously, we need to, it's not just a case of recognising that this is the only priority that the library has, but I guess what I'm saying is that I think there's better ways that we can do it, and that involves quite a difficult conversation. I mean, it is difficult. I don't have the answers for every library service. What I want to do is start the conversation, or continue the conversation, add to that, bring it up in priority, and see what results people come back with. Because, like I say, Kasi Gdynia, for example, they block library cards. If you go one day over and your item is one day over, your card is blocked until you bring the items back. Raises questions about, access to information and so on, but at least when those items come back, the emphasis then is on essentially just getting the items back. That's all they're worried about, so that they're open for other people. And that seems to have worked fairly well, whereas other library services have basically just got rid of fines, and that's it. And then they've found that there was no incentive, or there was no, it didn't have good return rates and so on. So it depends on your local context, I would say.
Excellent. We've got one more question down the front. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hi. May I please make a response in regards to how, Mr. CEO of State Library, SA, you mentioned how to encourage people to bring their library items back on time and maybe offer a reward system. I think that in itself might be a bit counterintuitive, because we're all about access and making sure that everyone has a chance to read what they want to read or view what they want to view. And Leela talked about not judging, in a previous talk, about not judging people's experiences and what makes them different to the way you might want them to behave. I just don't think that embodying that idea matches well with a rewards program.
If you don't want to fine, but you want to modify behaviour. All I'm saying is incentivising is a more humane way of doing it, rather than with fines in place. I don't agree with fines. I think they're appalling. I've seen the same evidence before. I've worked in libraries where we've removed fines. So, my view is about open access. But I also think there is a contract that you enter into with a library service that says, I will take this home free for 4 weeks, and I guarantee I will bring it back within that time, because there's probably someone else who wants it. So if you're entering into that contractual arrangement, then the onus is on, and I think it's the letting people feel the guilt of you're preventing someone else accessing that information.
Definitely. I do prescribe to that idea of that guilt.
I think James has started some excellent conversation, and we should definitely continue at lunchtime, which is the whole idea, and we should definitely continue the conversation in an ongoing basis. So that would be fantastic. Thank you so much, James.
Oh, thank you.
Hand as well.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much.